I want to also make clear that so overriding was this desire on the part of white reporters to get the right picture, that there are cases even of photographs being manipulated to send the right message. I'm showing you a rare production photograph. Unfortunately, the vast majority of photos that the editors actually marked up and used for the newspapers have been destroyed. But there's few that are preserved at the Library of Congress. And I show you on the screen here one that appeared in a now defunct New York newspaper that showed a series of 5 figures who were standing across the street from the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham when it was firebombed in September by the KKK. And it's showing their immediate reaction to the firebombing as they come out of this restaurant that they were in and they're looking out across the street. The 5 figures here were not of interest to the editor. You can see grease pencil cropping marks above the head of the boy and this little V that you can maybe make out below his shin. What the editors decided to do was to airbrush out the bodies of the figures directly behind the boy and to crop this little rectangle that appeared the next day in the newspaper showing this praying boy on his knees. The other figures, whatever we decide they're about, what they mean, what their facial expressions are telling us, would have created a kind of ambiguity of meaning that the editors weren't interested in. What they wanted was the simple resonant message of a boy literally on his knees before the damage inflicted by whites. That sent a clear signal to liberals in the North that they could understand, that they could empathize with. This would have complicated the message in ways that these editors deemed unproductive, ultimately. I don't want to make the claim that more so-called active pictures of blacks didn't exist during the period, but I am trying to sort of reinforce the notion that these pictures didn't appeal to white audiences, that they didn't do the kind of cultural work that was seen as productive. On the very last page of the Moore photo essay that I showed you in Life magazine, with all those iconic pictures, they had one page that was devoted to query for Southern whites, what now? So as a kind of aside, it's interesting that not a single black voice was quoted in that Life magazine spread on Birmingham. They didn't ask any activists what they were about, what they were concerned with, what they were trying to achieve. But on the final page of the essay, they did interview a cross-section of Birmingham's whites to ask them what the solutions were to America's racial problems during the period. But I wanted to, do I have yeah, I got a detail, okay. I'm directing your attention here to the bottom of the page where there's one final Moore image that is a closely cropped photo that shows the back of a Birmingham cop who, because it's cropped out you can't tell, but he's sitting astride a motorcycle with a billy club in his hand that projects into the scene. And then it's a series of African American young people who are taunting, waving their fingers at the policeman, basically trying to shame him. By cropping out the club, it changes the sort of dynamics of power in the scene, where it seems like the black figures are actually quite active and the white guy is just sort of sitting there. And it created a picture ultimately that I would argue was kind of unappealing to whites. The caption for this read, "Jeering mob, waggling their fingers at an officer, youthful Negroes taunt the police. Provocation like this to most whites is an open invitation to full-scale racial warfare." So I am making the claim that in this final image in Life, we're seeing a picture that to most whites would have seemed to be a more active portrayal of blacks. But I also think it's noteworthy that this photo, oops, I went too far, but that this photo is totally unknown to anyone outside of historians today. You know, most people have never seen this or can't remember this photo. It's only photo historians that know about it, because it didn't do work that was particularly interesting or productive for whites during the period, and it quickly dropped from view. It doesn't even appear in photographic surveys of the period, because it doesn't resonate with our image of what civil rights or what the 1960s or even what Birmingham was about. So it's kind of gone from our visual memory. With that image that cropped up next, the claim I wanted to make here is that it's not simply a media thing. There's a way in which these norms have seeped into our culture. In 1963, Andy Warhol famously took images from Birmingham and he created a series of paintings and silk screens that he called his Race Riot series. You can maybe just recognize that this is an image that I showed you before from Moore. We know from documents in the Warhol archive that not only did he take these photos of Birmingham from a generic source, but he took them specifically from Life magazine. So out of his copy from Life, he ripped out the 2-page spread, annotated it to his studio assistants to create that race riot I showed you. So we know that Warhol had before him images of so-called more active blacks to choose from, but that the image that he thought would most resonate were these. It's also interesting to note that while the race riot images came directly from Birmingham, Warhol throughout his career referred to these pictures as his Montgomery and his Selma pictures, in addition to his Birmingham pictures. He didn't particularly care about the city. To him it was Southern stuff, race riots, civil rights, it was all interchangeable. And another one of the points rather that I make about the civil rights imagery is that whites were able to empathize and to so-called understand what was going on only by radically decontextualizing the scenes. These images of Anniston, images of Selma, images of Birmingham, each of them had very specific grievances by local communities that were trying to initiate particular programs of change. But during the 1960s, and to some degree even today, audiences are very little aware of what the specific demands were, or the sort of socioeconomic tensions were. They just know generically civil rights. And so for many whites, whether it's Anniston or Birmingham or Selma, it doesn't really matter, because these things all say the same thing. But obviously for people involved in the struggle, these were very particular moments. Whites, again, needed to decontextualize before they could appreciate what was significant. Now, all of this becomes particularly interesting if you take a look at how the black press was representing civil rights during the same period. This is especially so since the black press didn't have the resources to send photographers to all these various southern cities to document what was actually going on. So what they did is they relied on wire services, white photographers taking photos. So the white press and the black press had the same pool of photographs to draw from, but they narrated a radically different struggle. I'm showing you, unfortunately it's from microfilm, so the reproduction quality isn't very good. On the far left-hand side, there's an image that's much more typical of what appeared in the white press, showing a dog that's tugging on the sweater of a black boy. In the center, one that more infrequently appeared in the white press, it shows a boy who's taken off his sweater and he's waving it like a matador's cape with a lunging police dog in the center. And on the far right, and this I do have, fortunately, a better reproduction, there's an African-American man who became outraged when one of Connor's police dogs tried to attack a child, and he pulled out a pocket knife from his pocket, and he's holding it here, blade down, you can maybe see, and he's in an effort to try and stab Connor's police dog. Now, this scene appeared very rarely in white papers, but appeared very frequently in black publications during the period, because it showed black taking an active role to dismantle segregation, using self-defense, but both violence at certain moments to try and change the status quo. Northern periodicals appreciated that this wasn't going to advance civil rights because this would be seen as too threatening an image. So while it was a picture of what was actually going on in the streets of Birmingham, it wasn't useful again to those northern publications like Life, so it tended not to get reproduced. But for a newspaper like the Pittsburgh Courier, or the Chicago Defender, or the Philadelphia Tribune, these were interesting photos to show African Americans not waiting for rights to be bestowed, but actively doing their best to defend black children who were in the process of being attacked. Now, sometimes when I present this kind of material and talk about the so-called passiveness in the presentation of the spectators, people make the argument, well, wasn't that precisely what Martin Luther King and much of the movement was trying to do? That is, they're famous for passive resistance. But passive resistance is a label that King almost never used, even though it appeared quite frequently in the white press. King talked about he was involved in nonviolent direct action, and he went out of his way to talk about the active nature of the protest. We can, I think, at least intellectually appreciate that being willing to stand in the street and allow a dog to lunge at one, or be willing to weather the blasts of a fireman's hose, is obviously not something that's particularly passive. But this framing was necessary in the white press, even as King ultimately, and most people in the SCLC actively rejected it.